Okay, we turn now away from the service of the Lord's Day and the theology of worship present in the Directory for Worship to specific worship services. And there's a lot of material in here. We're not going to cover all of it in these videos, but I do commend you a careful reading of these sections and understanding how they interact and how they can be very helpful and very important in terms of your ministry. Two significant worship services now to talk about: weddings and funerals. You'll notice that in the Directory for Worship, they aren't called weddings, they aren't called funerals. There's a section on marriage, and there's a section that's called services on the occasion of death, sometimes called the service in witness to the resurrection. I chose to title this Weddings and Funerals to note the ways that we're often working across language and with different meanings, because people probably won't come to you and say, can you do my marriage? They'll say, can you do my wedding? And so we're always working across these words with related but not identical meanings as we work with people in the service of God's purpose in their lives. So first, marriage and what the Directory for Worship says about marriage, and then particularly a worship service for service and witness to the resurrection for a person who has died. For both of these, I have made a folder on the Moodle that contains materials that I have used in my own ministry, and I'll say a little bit more about the specifics of those at the proper place in the video. So the meaning of marriage, this is directly from W40601. In baptism, every Christian is claimed in the covenant of God's faithful love. Marriage is a gift of God given to all humankind for the well-being of the entire human family. Marriage involves a unique commitment between two people, traditionally a man and a woman, to love and support each other for the rest of their lives. Unites them, mentions civil law, the contract, and then in the Reformed tradition, that's a covenant. A lot in this paragraph. This is, of course, one of the significant recent changes in our Directory for Worship and our Book of Order around our definition of marriage, which used to define it as between a man and a woman, and now says between two people, traditionally a man and a woman. I want to note a couple of things about this. One is the claim, the theological claim, that marriage is a gift to all humankind. It's not just a Christian thing. It is something for all humankind, for the well-being of the entire human family. The tension there in our Directory for Worship between two people, and then traditionally a man and a woman, and how we deal with gender and marriage. And then the differentiation between civil law and a contract and Christian marriage, which is a covenant. So all part of that, and all things for you to consider as you think about your own understanding of marriage and work with couples who come to you to be married. Preparing for marriage, again, directly from the Book of Order, you'll notice that they can request a service of Christian marriage be conducted by a teaching elder. The asterisk there is in the Book of Order, and then in those places it can indicate a commissioned ruling elder that has been commissioned to do weddings, because commissioned ruling elders can have different commissions, and one of them can be to be an officiant. I want you to see that a couple requesting the service of Christian marriage shall receive instruction from the teaching elder. According to our Book of Order, if we do not provide instruction to a couple that comes to us to be married, we are out of compliance with the Book of Order. It's not a may, it's not even a should. We are to do this. In very technical language, and I have seen this happen, if a couple goes to get a divorce and it's a highly contested divorce, and there are resources, people and attorneys start to look at things like this to say, was this really a marriage? And if they can find ways that we were not doing our duty, we have those kinds of liabilities. So there's those kinds of legal ramifications, but there's also the theological, spiritual, moral instruction that we are to provide couples who come to us for a wedding with instruction. And you'll notice that we have wide latitude to decide whether or not we will officiate. If they need to demonstrate sufficient understanding of the nature of the marriage covenant, commitment to living their lives together according to its value. We may seek the counsel of the session making a decision, but we don't have to. It's the session that has the authority to permit or deny the use of church property for a marriage service. Very clearly in our Book of Order, ordained teaching elders have absolute latitude about whether or not we officiate at a wedding. And the session is the group that decides whether it happens on the property. Very clear, and I think important for a session and a pastor to talk about before we're in the midst of this, so that the roles are clear. Weddings and polity. Minister of Word and Sacrament decides at what weddings he or she will officiate. The session decides which weddings occur on church property. We have a responsibility to provide instruction. And then what I like to say is we're planning for a wedding. We're also planning for a marriage. I provided for you in that folder a couple of things. One is an outline of the wedding service that I used and provided to couples. I did premarital counseling with every couple, usually using a resource called Prepare Enrich, which is trainings available online. And then I would give the couple a copy of the wedding service with instructions of what they were to do. And then we talked again and worked to craft a service that had, in my opinion, theological integrity. And I think often for the couple, what they were looking for was a person. They wanted to be personal to them. But we were trying to do both, not just plan for a wedding, but also plan for a marriage. And then payment is something to be negotiated with a session. Often I would recommend there be a session policy on weddings that talk about music, that talk about the use of the building, and that talk about the finances. There's a wide variance about whether or not pastors are paid for members and not for members, whether there's a differentiation. It is a significant time commitment on the part of the pastor, often involving an evening and a day, usually involving a weekend. Turning to funerals. Funerals are, you'll notice that they are the completion of baptism. We affirm with tears and joy the good news of the gospel and the hope of the resurrection. They're a witness to the resurrection. It means our primary focus is on Jesus Christ and his work, continuing work in this person's life, body, future, and bringing the community of faith together to express our sorrow, our grief, and also our hope. The setting of a funeral. The Book of Order says most appropriately held in the congregation's usual place of worship, demonstrating continuity of the community's faith, life, and hope. This is what the Book of Order says. There's wide variance in what people do, and it can be regional in terms of how people are involved themselves with funeral homes, with gravesides. I have never done a funeral as part of the service of the Lord's Day. It is possible. You'll notice that takes the approval of the session, and then there's talk about when the committal happens. There's a lot about ordering of worship for funerals. The first thing I'd have you notice, lots of text means there's lots of work on it, lots of angst about it. Funerals are the collision of people's grief and not very much time, which means that you're both making decisions quickly in a place where people are not making decisions very well at all. So there's lots of angst about it. I think any work that you do in yourself with a session, with staff, about what happens for funerals will pay dividends and help people be calm as you're moving through this. You need to think about whether or not to use a pall, the location of the casket. The Book of Order says that fraternal, civic, and military rites are to be conducted separately. Sometimes that means you say at the graveside, Amen, and something else happens. Sometimes it means that we're flexible. I gave you a sheet in the folder for this that helps plan for funerals, which include many, many details that matter. Whether people get greeted when they come for a visitation time, who locks up a building, whether a casket stays in the building overnight. There's a lot of details to think about, best thought about and talked about beforehand so that you can move through it with a minimum of angst on your own part. Other speaking is a decision that you as the pastor make, including whether or not people are able to freely share memories. Again, it is, I think there's wide latitude about what different regions and different congregations do in these matters. Who's in charge of a funeral is a complex question because there's the family, there's almost always a funeral home and a funeral director involved, and there's musicians. So being clear about your own role and being clear about other people's roles, developing good working partnerships with funeral directors, which I would say I have found really helpful and often just want to do what's best for the family. I think a primary consideration in funerals is care for families who are in grief, and it is not the time to have deep theological conversations about what is most theologically appropriate. My own conviction was that gave me wide latitude to allow for things to happen in funerals, like pictures up front, like open caskets, that would not fit with my own personal theology of what's going on in a funeral service. But it's not the time to have a family sitting there in grief and mad because the funeral's closed. In my opinion, pastors make widely different decisions about that. My basic, I think, commendation to you would be to think through who you are, what you want, what your own boundaries are, because I would predict no matter what they are, they'll get pushed, even if they're pretty broad, because people in grief do things that are sometimes even surprising to themselves a couple years later. Good to think about payment, good to talk about that with a funeral home, often taken care of by a funeral home, not always. I would recommend to you clarity with the session about whether there's a fee to use the building and what kind of fees there are for any musicians that are involved. So those can be very clear for families. I found in my own ministry that people were not at all upset about paying an honorarium to an organist or other musicians. They did sometimes, particularly if they were members, feel upset about paying a fee to use the building because this was their church, and I think there's ways to navigate that. Baptism bonus. So we talked a little bit about baptism last week. Because I was putting together these packets, I put together a folder with baptism that has a packet that I gave to families to send with a letter to them for them to read, something for them to sign, so that I could have integrity in myself that I had given them good information about baptism. I would probably rewrite some of that. The language seemed a little stilted to me as I reread it, but I put it up for you. There's a baptism liturgy in there. It's the baptism liturgy that I used with children and altered it some for adults. A lot of decisions to make about baptisms. Adults in baptism, when and how it happens, it needs to happen in the context of a worship service, but you do have some latitude about that. Need to think about what goes in a bulletin around baptism. Some pastors put in a little paragraph or an insert about baptism to explain it. Some pastors, I did hold the infant and walk down the aisles to give people a view. Pastors have different opinions about that and often strong feelings about whether or not that's appropriate or showing off. Local custom would be a good thing to know as you enter into a pastorate. And I, in my own pastorate, made an intentional decision to try to include children by having a special question with them. They came down front, often had to have adults to help that, and they found that, I think, helpful to be included. So I hope that's helpful. I hope those resources are helpful. I would encourage you to, if they're helpful, to certainly personalize them and change them and ask any questions you've got about them. Thanks.